Hi there, I'm Natasha Zouves. On this episode of The Truth of the Matter, I want to tell you the story of Ebb Cade. He was in good health, a 55-year-old African-American man who worked as a cement mixer. He was on his way to work one day in Tennessee when a car crash in March of 1945 altered the course of his life forever. He suffered some broken bones, a fractured femur, kneecap, forearm, but instead of treatment, he became a test subject while in the care of Oak Ridge Army Hospital, the first of at least 18 test subjects injected with plutonium in this country, given to him without his knowledge or consent, 17 days after the accident. The injection given to Cade is detailed in this formerly classified document called Experiment 1, using P49, which journalist Eileen Welsome says is code for radioactive plutonium. She says the purpose to monitor how a human subject reacted to the chemical solution, tracking it in the blood, urine, stool, even in the bones. You see, Cade's bones weren't even set until nearly 3 weeks after the accident in order to leave time for the plutonium to circulate in his body and for bone samples to be taken. Welsome reporting that 15 of Cade's teeth were pulled after injection. Welsome also reports the 4.7 micrograms of plutonium given to Cade in his left arm, nearly 5 times the amount scientists at that time felt could be retained without harm in the human body, came from Los Alamos, the central laboratory for the Manhattan Project, where top scientists under J. Robert Oppenheimer designed and built the world's first atomic bombs. Also a part of the project, a classified construction site in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the plant that Ebb Cade was reporting to before he was hospitalized and labeled as Human Product 12, an experiment on the effects of a bomb-making substance he never agreed to be a part of. Journalist Eileen Welsome says an enlisted man reached out to her who told her that he had been emptying Cade's bedpan months after he was brought to the hospital. That man saying that Cade still appeared to be in great pain, saying, quote, "He seemed in terrible shape. He looked to me like he was not going to make it for a few days." One can only imagine what was going through Ebb Cade's mind as he went into the hospital after a crash with some broken bones, and his condition only worsened. Pieces of tissue and bone and teeth taken from his body for study. Eventually, he made his escape, slipping out of his room before he was discharged, abruptly moving states to North Carolina, where he died 8 years later. The cause of death listed as heart failure, but today it's still not known if the plutonium injected into his veins played a part in his death. Journalist Welsome notes his otherwise good health before this, and that Cade had siblings who lived to 100. And while Ebb Cade was the first, he was not the last human test subject, just one of 18 people known to have been injected with plutonium.
We discovered soon after I entered office that with the specter of an atomic war looming like Armageddon, far nearer than it does today, the United States government actually did carry out on our citizens experiments involving radiation. In one scientist injected plutonium into 18 patients without their knowledge.
We may have not known about any of this if it wasn't for one journalist who worked to declassify documents, who followed the paper trail, and who ultimately exposed this human experimentation. She's the author of the Plutonium Files, America's secret medical experiments in the Cold War, and her investigation into the secret tests on Americans earned her a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. Eileen Welsome, welcome. Thank you so much for making the time.
Well, thank you so much for your interest and for having me.
I'm very interested in how all of this began, because you say that it actually started with dumped animals who were riddled with tumors, largely beagles, if I'm not mistaken, and one small footnote that you ended up noticing that blew everything wide open. Can you tell me that story?
So I was a reporter at the Albuquerque Tribune. There's a lot of military bases in New Mexico, and in these animal dumps were radioactive animals. And so my question as a reporter was, why are they radioactive? What did they do to them? And why are they in the dump? So Um, the Air Force gathered a bunch of documents for me to read, and I went over to the base one afternoon, Friday, and sat down and began reading. And as you mentioned at the start of your show, most of these documents or these scientific reports were on animals that had been injected with plutonium. A lot of them were beagle dogs, and they watched as the tumors developed and progressed in these animals. I continued looking through the documents, and as I was just about to finish my work for the day, I saw a footnote describing 18 individuals injected with plutonium. And so I literally kind of sat back and thought about it for a minute. I couldn't believe that the government could have done this. And of course, I was thinking, did these people die? Did they develop tumors? Were they in pain? What happened to them? And so that began my long research and odyssey story.
What is so amazing is through this doggedness, and I want to talk more about this refusal to be discouraged and to give up. And even when you say there were moments that the government discouraged you as well, and where even you were interviewing researchers, interviewing doctors of these individuals who said things like, we've moved on. Why are you looking at this? Why are you dragging up this old information? Through your work, eventually you exposed these names of these individuals, and you were the person who many times called either that person or their surviving family members, and for the first time told them what actually happened to them. I want to talk about two individuals in particular, the first of the 18 and the last of the 18. Ebb Cade at the beginning, and then Elmer Allen at the end. Elmer Allen was the first name that you were actually able to uncover. Is that correct?
That's correct.
This was all very coded and very difficult to break. Tell me a little bit about the code, what Elmer Allen was called, and how you actually connected the dots and found out his name and who this man was.
So Elmer Allen in the documents was identified as Cal 3. I learned later Cal stood for California, and he was the third patient injected in California. But I didn't know, I didn't know what his real name was, if he was still alive, if he had relatives that were still alive, where he lived. This was trying to find 18 people in a country of millions.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the mystery that I had to solve. So I started really simply, and I should say this is before the internet. The internet was just coming into existence when my stories were published, but so what I did was very crude. I took, these were 18 people. I took 18 sheets of yellow paper. I put their code names up top. And each time I got the most insignificant piece of data about these 18 people, I wrote it down on these sheets of paper. So eventually I developed a profile of these individuals. So I knew, for example, about Elmer Allen, that he was an African American. He would have been quite elderly, perhaps 80 years old, and then his left leg had been amputated. Those were the things I knew about Cal 3. I got a document from the DOE. They redacted all the names of the patients, all the names of the doctors. But in one document, it said the physician of Cal, the physician of Cal 3 contacted somebody in Italy, Texas. And so there was the two words, Italy, Texas. So I knew I had gone to the University of Texas. I knew that Italy had to be a small town. And I got out a map. I found out it was south of Dallas. And I thought, I can find this man. even if I have to go to Italy, door to door and walk the streets. So I got a hold of a number for Italy City Hall, and I called a clerk. I described this man, African American, about 80 years old, left leg amputated. And she said, well, you're looking for Elmer Allen, but he died a year ago. Would you like his wife's number? And I said, yes. So within 60 seconds, I was talking to his wife, Redden Allen. But before I did that, I have to say, I had to get up and walk around the newsroom. I worked in a press room, and I had to really, really think. Each time I found one of these individuals, I had to do a lot of thinking before I called them. Just because it was shocking for me, it was shocking for them. And I didn't want to put any words in anyone's mouth about their memories. And so I called Fredna Allen. She was a retired school teacher. She still lived in Italy, Texas. She said, I'd like to speak with my daughter. Eventually, we met, all three of us, in Dallas, Texas. And Fredna had a couple of documents that she brought that confirmed that Elmer Allen was indeed Cal 3. And that was the beginning of the end of the story.
Wow. How did they receive this news that, this widow's husband who had passed, this daughter, that her father had been injected with plutonium in his leg without his knowledge, without his consent?
So Fredna was a very religious person and very sweet and gentle. And she just, she just said, well, this is how people will do you when they don't know any better. But Elmarine, the daughter, she grew up in the 60s. She was much more militant and she was much more outspoken. And she was outraged by this experiment. And that outrage increased the more she learned about what had happened to him. And that's what I discovered was true about all the relatives. They all responded in a state of shock, but then they, over time, they just grew more indignant and outraged that their loved ones were treated as guinea pigs and as throwaways and as unimportant. And so, I mean, every one of these individuals had an extraordinary story to tell.
You also said something that surprised me before, which is that there is the shock, there is the betrayal, there is the anger, all of which makes all the sense in the world to me. You said there was often embarrassment and shame as well for these individuals and their families. Why is that?
It had something to do with the fact that they felt I should have been more aware, been stronger. I should have seen that these people were pulling the wool over the eyes of my loved ones or myself. It's like anybody that would be suddenly discover that something had been done to them without their knowledge and consent. It was there was an element of shame in that went along with these discoveries. And I tried to, talk to them about that. And I said, look, this was different times. These scientists were practiced in the art of deception for whatever reason. And so how could you know what was going on? They didn't tell you, they didn't plan to tell you.
Well, and you trust your doctor. I mean, even now and especially then. And especially then you go in and so many of these individuals too, we're talking about after a car accident, after a railroad accident in the case of the individual we're talking about, and you trust in their care. I want to talk about what actually happened to this man before we get too far, because I know we skipped over that part of the story. Tell me more about him. How old was he when this began? He was working on a railroad. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So Elmer Allen, he was middle-aged at the time. He had 2 young children, and his wife, Fredna. They were originally from Italy, Texas, but they moved out to Oakland, California, because they thought they could have a better life there. Jim Crow laws were still in effect in Texas, and segregation was heavily enforced. So they they were engaged on a new life. They were raising their children. Elmer was working as a railroad porter. His route went from Oakland to Chicago, and in Chicago, the train jerked suddenly. He fell and injured his knee, and that was the beginning of the end for him. He returned to Oakland, saw the company doctors. His leg swelled. It didn't improve. Eventually, he was seen at a clinic in Berkeley, or San Francisco, I should say. And they diagnosed him as having an osteogenic sarcoma in this injured leg, in this injured knee.
Which is important because you flag that this is a cancer that usually only occurs in children, that it would be highly unusual for him to have this knee injury while on the job and for them to discover a bone cancer of that nature inside of his leg. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the fact is, the doctors themselves were at odds about what was going on in that knee. There was no history of cancer in his family. And as you mentioned, these kind of cancers occur normally in young children. They rarely live to adulthood. So, but anyway, long story short, some of the Manhattan Project doctors were affiliated with the hospital in San Francisco. They heard about Elmer Allen after he was diagnosed with this osteogenic bone cancer, and they decided the only way to save him was to amputate his left leg. 3 days, I should say, before they amputated his leg, they brought him in. They drew a bull's eye on his left calf. They injected plutonium in that left calf. 3 days later, they brought him back into the hospital, or he was still in the hospital, and they amputated his left leg. They took that limb, that amputated limb, to Berkeley, to one of the labs there, where they converted it to ash in a furnace, and then through a series of chemical processes, studied the plutonium that remained in that leg.
Hmm. Do you believe that he, A, truly had cancer, that whatever he had could only actually be treated by amputating the leg? I mean, or do you believe that this was some sort of cover story and way to create a scenario and a convenient case where they could inject plutonium?
Oh, I totally believe that. I have no doubts about that. There was a lot of mixed analysis going on, or mixed opinions about what was going on in that knee. And so the Manhattan Project scientists, in their haste, in their desire to uh, obtain information, made this gentleman a cripple for the rest of his life. And it was really horrific. And after after the amputation, he could no longer work as a railroad porter. So he and Fredna returned to Italy with their 2 young children, and Fredna went to work as a school teacher and supported the family. And he he sort of became a town character. He did tell his doctor that he thought he had been the subject of a human experiment, but his doctor didn't believe him. They diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic. Um, and he sort of lived out his life as a marginal character in Italy, Texas. I should say, going back to the deception, that all of these 18 patients were deceived because none of them were told that they were being injected with plutonium. Plutonium at the time was a classified word. This experiment was really flawed. Um, they were all alleged to be terminally ill, but several of the patients, including Elmer Allen, lived for 30 years. Um, a lot of them, they had many different medical issues, so there was no way to sort of draw any conclusions from this experiment. So it was not only an unethical experiment, but it was also bad science.
Absolutely. And tell me, it's not as if they injected plutonium into his leg and it just stayed bound up in the leg and they amputated it and there were no after effects. How did this affect him afterwards? Was there still plutonium in his system after the amputation?
Yes, there was the plutonium, which has a half-life of 24,000 years, which
24,000 years.
yes.
I just want to emphasize that. And you said that in several of the individuals' bodies, they continue to track them for years to come. In some cases, even asking the families to allow the bodies to be exhumed to continue studying pulling tissue and seeing the after effects of it, and that the impact of the plutonium only grew over time in some of their bodies.
Well, you're exactly right. Plutonium acts like calcium, and it went in most of these individuals, it would eventually end up in their bones, sometimes other organs, but that would be the resting place. And once it was in the bones, it would continue to irradiate the nearby blood forming tissues for the rest of these individuals' lives. So many of them that lived for a long time, um, like one woman in Rochester, New York, I mean, she was exhausted for the rest of her life.
Hmm.
Um,
Is this Janet you're referring to?
Granted, exactly.
Right.
Um,
And you say for her, I mean, she was completely debilitated. That basically all she could do was sit and knit. That was literally the only activity that she was able to perform. And that for the longest time, her family dismissed her behavior as being that of a hypochondriac, that she was making some of it up. She wasn't truly this chronically exhausted and just running at absolute zero and her body in pain, et cetera, et cetera. What was it like to tell her family? No, actually, she was injected with plutonium.
I mean, I've met all of or many of their well, I met their son, who's
Mm,
deceased now, and I know their grandchildren. And they were they were in a state of shock. I mean,
mm,
they eventually got the documents themselves,
mm,
and they they read through them, and they got an attorney, of course, but they were in a state of shock for a long time. And then that shock, as in many of the cases, turned to outrage, and they spoke up um, and became they became spokesmen for their own stories. And
mm.
that's what I let I tried to stay in the background
Sure.
once this story grew public, because I thought, well, let the patients speak for themselves. you know, they're so much more eloquent than I am. And so that's what many of them did. They went public with their stories and told their stories. Elmerine, Elmer's daughter, is still telling the story of her father.
And what did happen to her father? Did he suffer any ill health effects? Did the plutonium continue in his body?
So once they amputated that leg, there was plutonium in that limb. They found that when they ashed the limb in a furnace in Berkeley. However, so that meant that there was not that much plutonium circulating in his body, but it was there. And they brought several of these individuals back into the laboratory in the 70s, and they found plutonium in his body. They found it in his bones. They found it in his urine, in his blood, etc. So, and as you mentioned earlier, that was all part of a second phase of the experiment, in which the scientists actually exhumed a number of these patients, didn't tell the surviving family members the real reason for the exhumations. And they found in one case, they found plutonium in the hair of one of the deceased victims. And they theorized, well, hey, this might be a way that we can figure out how if someone was exposed to plutonium or not, if it showed up in the hair.
I want to talk about the path of exposing a lot of this because it begins with Elmer and that one summary document that reveals the town of Italy, Texas. And you call and you are able to make that connection because of that detail of his leg being amputated, truly, and the small pieces of information in terms of his age and demographic. And this sort of opens the door to you starting to identify the names to a lot of the codes that are in these documents describing these 18 cases. You also end up looking into the case of Ebb Cade, who is the very first man injected. Can you tell me a little bit about his story and what happened to him?
Certainly. So he was a really his was a really interesting case. He was the gentleman injected at Oak Ridge, and this is before there are 3 people injected before Trinity and before the 2 bombs were dropped on Japan. So Ebb was injected. He was a cement worker, and he worked at the Oak Ridge gaseous diffusion plant, which enriched uranium. And he was on his way to work with his brothers one morning. He was involved in an auto accident. He was taken to the Oak Ridge Hospital. Scientists at the Oak Ridge Hospital had received from Los Alamos National Laboratory a vial of plutonium. And while Ebb was recovering from the injuries and bone fractures due to his auto accident, he was injected with plutonium. And after he was injected, the surgeons removed pieces of bone, pieces of tissue from his gum, some of his teeth, some of his jaw, to study where the plutonium went in his body. And as they expected, most of it did go to the bone. Remember, I said plutonium acts like calcium. So, Ebb was in the hospital for a long time. And they waited to set his bones to make sure that the plutonium was circulating widely. And they had samples of his blood, urine, stool specimens. They could determine how much plutonium he was excreting. After his bones were set, he remained in the hospital. And a man wrote to me. This was after this story became public, and he sent me a letter. And he said, Eileen, I think I was a young enlisted man at the time, and I was in charge of taking Ebb Cade's bedpans away.
Mm.
And he said he was just moaning. It was like he wasn't going to make it for a few days. Well, eventually, he kind of got well enough, and he discharged himself from the hospital, and he disappeared. And he went home to North Carolina, the Greensboro area, and he lived for, I want to say, 8 years after the injection. Not a long time. So that's sort of my intuition was that the plutonium probably hastened his death
Mhm.
because he had siblings that lived to 100.
Mm.
He was in his early 60s when he died. So I don't know much about his life beyond the injection and the ordering of the injection. And I should say that this experiment, the genesis of this experiment was Los Alamos National Laboratory. And it was after a vial of plutonium exploded in the face of a young chemist. And at that point, the scientists in labs were freaking out, thinking, oh my God, are we all going to end up with cancer? We've got to do something. And this sort of led to this experiment, which I should point out was approved by J. Robert Oppenheimer.
You discovered, and through your research, that Oppenheimer was very aware of these experiments being carried out. Is that correct?
That's correct. There were minor accidents, although we have many, many kilograms of plutonium today. At the time, all the plutonium in the world would have fit on the head of a pin.
Hmm.
And the scientists knew that they were going to start getting kilogram amounts of plutonium to build these bombs. And as the plutonium was rising in the laboratories, the accidents were occurring. And so Oppenheimer and the rest of the individuals involved with the biomedical aspects of the Manhattan Project were frightened. And the reason they were frightened is because the only data they had were the radium dial painters.
Mhm.
And they knew the doctors were aware that the radium dial painters developed these horrific cancers in their mouth and jaws, etc.
And so for anyone who is listening or watching who is not familiar with that, these were largely young women, factories full of young women who were painting fluorescent radium on the faces of dials of watches, and they would often be encouraged to use their mouths to form these very fine points on these brushes and to paint the dials. They were told that it was completely harmless. Some of them would also paint their nails or apply it to their faces because it was beautiful and it glowed. And these young women suffered from horrific after effects from it. Cancers that would eat away at their jaws, circulate throughout their body. But you're saying that was the backdrop to these scientists who were involved in the Manhattan Project starting to become concerned, okay, we are dealing with even microscopic levels of plutonium, and that there was an accident in particular in the lab where there was a young lab tech or chemist, and there was an explosion and some of the plutonium went into his mouth. And that this was the genesis for we need to study this and start injecting people. Is that how that occurred?
That's exactly how that occurred. The chemist was a gentleman named Don Mastic, and I spoke with him many times. I think he's deceased now, but he had been recruited by J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was working with microscopic doses of plutonium. A vial exploded, some went into his mouth, and he was okay. He never developed cancer. Most of it was excreted, or it was removed through his stomach was pumped and his mouth was washed multiple times. So most of that plutonium did not go into his system. But
Wow.
that was the genesis for the plutonium experiment.
Did he know when you spoke with him that the extent to what ended up happening after that one lab experiment that 18 people, without their knowledge or consent, would end up being injected with plutonium?
He had no idea.
What did he think of that?
I mean, he was of a different generation.
Hmm.
He went to Tinian when they were loading the atomic bombs for Japan. He was very patriotic.
Hmm.
He didn't say that he agreed with what was done, and he felt like they should have been given their informed consent. But he was also felt like there were things that had to be done in the interest of national security
Hmm.
and protecting the United States.
Okay. I want to return to Ebb Cade quickly. What strikes you the most about this case? Because I know for me, reading about this for the first time, it sounds like a horror movie, honestly. That this otherwise um, very healthy man, for the most part, he gets in a car accident and he has a broken bone and he goes to the hospital, and these things that start happening to him, the injection, the tissue sampling, teeth being pulled, he's in agony, his bone is being delayed, being set, he is not improving or being discharged in the time frame you would expect for a broken bone or a few broken bones from an accident. And clearly, I mean, details are sparse. Unfortunately, we don't have the benefit of a intensive interview with him before he passed away eight some years later. But what must have been going through his mind when he basically escapes the hospital in the end? He leaves and pretty much immediately moves to another state. What strikes you about the case of Ebb Cade?
There's a couple of things about that case. I really worked on this part of it was who performed that injection.
Mm-hmm.
What doctor was able to set aside the Hippocratic oath and inject this man with something that they thought at the time and still think it was the most toxic substance in the world. And there was a physician named Joseph Allen, who said for his entire life, I did the injection, but it was only under Army orders.
Hmm.
And he claimed that a physician named Heimer Friedel ordered it. And all the documents support that claim. And I interviewed Heimer Friedel multiple times, and he denied giving the order.
Hmm.
I also talked to the head of security for the Manhattan Project, who was Leslie Groves, head of security, and asked him about this experiment. And did he know about it? And he said, well, it seems like something I should know about, but I didn't know anything about it. So I met with denials from anybody who was alive at the time and recalled it. So I sort of see myself as a link between their time and the present. So most everybody is deceased now with any knowledge of what happened. And I was just lucky that I was able to interview some individuals before they passed.
Mm. Mm.
You know, I don't mean to go on, but Mary Jean Connell, she was a really incredible woman in Rochester, New York. And after this experiment became public, she said, that sounds like something that happened to me. And
Mm.
it turned out that she had been injected with uranium.
Mm.
And she was one of 6 patients in Rochester who were injected with uranium. And she said, she felt like she felt she felt destroyed by the
Mm.
knowledge of that.
Mm.
She's
Mm.
deceased now.
Yeah. To your point, I do feel that so acutely that there is a ticking clock on these stories. I'm so grateful for the work that you've done and the people that you spoke with and the oral histories that you've taken and your work in preserving that before so many of them have passed. The work that we have done in Pruitt-Igoe and trying to uncover what happened there, I very much felt the temporal pressure of that. Um, there was a woman that we were supposed to speak with who was suffering from multiple cancers and in a great deal of pain. And it was a matter of weeks. We simply couldn't get to her in time. She passed away before we could get on the ground and conduct our interview. I spoke with her daughter instead. And with the experiments that started coming to light after you published your articles, and I want to talk about that a little bit later, how you came forward with this information, you published it, and it snowballed in an incredible way. Other journalists also picked up that torch and in their own communities started looking at the experiment on 800 plus pregnant women who were given radioactive cocktails of iron without their knowledge or consent. The Fernald School and the boys, many of them orphans, given radioactive oatmeal. The list goes on. But in terms of what happened in Pruitt-Igoe, it is interesting because a lot of these residents were children when it happened, and they are still alive. Some of them are still alive to talk about what happened. The ones who are still alive are the ones who are healthy enough and who have survived. They've buried their loved ones. They've watched their siblings die. They say of unusual cancers and unusual illnesses throughout their communities. The government admits to fogging them with zinc cadmium sulfide. They do not admit to a radioactive component to that spray. Dr. Lisa Martino-Taylor, who I know you are familiar with, believes that with the documents that she has FOIA'd and with the contextual evidence she has put together, she believes that there very likely was radiation in that spray.
We know that the people who designed the study, who oversaw the study, these were all the radiological weapons experts who were looking at open air radiological weapons.
What is your sense around the ticking clock on these types of stories and people who say, why does it matter? This happened so very long ago, and many of the people affected are no longer here. Many of the perpetrators are no longer alive. You say that in some cases the government laughed in your face. Those were your words as you were trying to surface this information. Why does this matter?
Well, I think, for the individuals, first of all, it matters. The truth of their story, the need to validate what happened. I think for the rest of us, it's a cautionary tale about the powers of secrecy and the need to always stay alert to what's going on in our government and in our world. And I think that if it could happen to the individuals that you researched, that it could happen to any of us. And it's part of history now. And it's also, it I mean, I imagine these kind of things are still going on. I don't want to be, it, uh, you know, extremely paranoid, but uh, this took 50 years to reveal, and so I imagine, there are other things going on right now that we may not find out about for many decades.
Are you confident that government experiments on Americans without their knowledge or consent have ceased?
Oh
Or do
no,
you believe they continue?
I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a realist. But I think that sure, things are going on without people's knowledge or consent. It's kind of the way of humanity.
After we ran our investigation on what happened in Pruitt-Igoe, a large number of people viewed that on television. More than 1.6 million watched the investigation online. And the benefit of running something digitally is the comments that instantly pour in and getting to see the reaction from viewers. of course, a great deal of outrage, and also a great deal of comments that said things like, I will never trust the government again. I will never trust science again. I will never trust a doctor again. Things like, why would I ever get a vaccine again after seeing this sort of information? Is that what you want people to take away from your work and from the Plutonium Files, your book?
No, I mean, I think you have to trust some people. You have to trust doctors. You just have to be very careful in who you place your trust. And also you have to do your homework um, and study as much as you can. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that went to medical school, that did
Mm,
postgraduate work.
mm.
And if you're faced with a complex disease like Alzheimer's or something else, a particular form of cancer, you who are you going to trust?
Mm.
When you have to find that trustworthy person.
It's so hard, isn't it?
So hard, exactly.
Speaking of doctors, I want to talk about Elmer because it is interesting that he believed that something happened to him, that he was used as a test subject. And even when he was outside of the care of the doctor who initially injected him, he was with his own doctor later on. He told that doctor what he believed happened, and he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. I find it fascinating. You actually interviewed his doctor. Is that correct?
I did.
And you found out that that doctor was in communication with the DOE.
Medical records are confidential. And so again, I was working with Fredna Allen, that's Elmer's wife, and she gave me permission to talk to his doctor.
Mhm.
The doctor talked to me. And I said, "Well, you you know, did you know that he had been injected with plutonium?" And he said, "Well," in his Texas accent, he said, "Well, he told me something about that, and I put it in the back of my bonnet, and I didn't know whether to believe him or not." And, I queried him a little further, and he said, partially because of this, I diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic. And, and then when we got the documents after that initial conversation, there were documents showing he had been in contact with the Department of Energy people, um, offering to send them information, and if Elmer died, to notify them so they could take his body and do an autopsy on him.
Mm.
So he was tracked to his death.
You interviewed several medical professionals and scientists in the course of your work. You say that one of them described how they chose people for these experiments. Do you remember what they said?
He said, basically, we chose the vulnerable, people that didn't know enough to ask questions. Do you mean you wouldn't have picked children, say, that were children of doctors? And he said, that's right. We wouldn't choose them. We chose vulnerable people, people that were trusting, that didn't know enough to ask questions. There was also an element of class, I thought, involved in this. So it was people who didn't have the education, who were blue collar workers, um, that were selected.
Hmm. Talk to me about culpability in all of this. Was any single scientist or researcher ever held accountable for these experiments?
No, as I mentioned, many of them were dead. Those that were alive, uh, changed their stories or were interviewed or declined to be interviewed. And um, what happened was there was President Clinton formed a panel to look at this stuff, and they condemned the institutions, some of the universities. They issued generic condemnations, but basically the doctors got off scot-free. They got away with it.
What do you think of that?
I don't know. I think it just added to the to the injustice of this entire experiment. I mean, there were so many similarities in these experiments. Even, you go beyond the plutonium experiments, you go to the Vanderbilt women. These were all pregnant women. Um, they did what their doctors told them. Their doctors brought in these drinks that they said were vitamin drinks. The women drank it. They trusted their doctors. They didn't ask questions. The patients in Cincinnati who had their whole bodies irradiated, again, they trusted their doctors. Their doctors said this might shrink or slow the growth of their tumors. They believed them. That it was it was a very at the end it was a very, very sad story.
Mm, mm. What was this experience like for you working on this for so many years? I know that for me, when I am working on an investigation like this, it is such a visceral experience for me that I feel it like I was telling Dr. Lisa Martino Taylor this, I feel it like a roiling in my gut. I literally feel an upset stomach as I do this work. It wakes me up at 3 a.m. when I think about the injustice and individuals who were involved in these things, that these terrible things happen to. What was it like for you uncovering this? Because it is thanks to you that we know the names of the people that this happened to. If it weren't for your work, I don't know that any of these other cases as well afterwards, the radioactive oatmeal cases, the pregnant women cases, the full body radiation that happened in Cincinnati, I don't know that any of it would have necessarily come to light. What was it like for you to go through this experience?
First, let me address something you said. I am so glad people like you are out there, to pick up the torch and to have the fire in your belly to go forward with this, despite waking up at 3 a.m. I mean, that just, it just kind of brings tears to my eyes. And, so yeah, I was like you. I was, there was, I mean, there was so many emotions over so many years that occurred. Um, there was I can't, I have to say that each time I uncovered or broke a code, it was a feeling of, yes, we did it. And so there was that. And then talking to the family members, and then, they did get some justice. So there was satisfaction in that for me that happened.
Mm,
Um, but I also, was exhausted
yeah.
after all of this. And I'm really not a person that likes the limelight at all. I know that's like so old school, but that's me. And, I just, I did interviews. I went on radio shows. I did this stuff because I thought the story needed to be out there, not because I really liked doing it.
Hmm.
I just felt that it was part of my job. And so, I still will do this. But I was telling my husband this morning, I said, I don't know if I'm going to do this anymore. I just, I mean, it's just part of what you do. But I'm very impressed by what you said and what you're doing, and that there are people like you out there doing it. It's fantastic.
Thank you for saying that. It means a great deal to me coming from you. I want to ask about difficulties that you faced. For anyone listening or watching who is not familiar with submitting a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act, it is a law that is meant to allow transparency and the shining of a light on buried or secretive government documents. It is, however, not that simple a lot of the time. We submitted a FOIA request for this missing Joint Quarterly Report 5 that we have been trying to get our hands on. It is the white whale of Dr. Lisa Martino-Taylor. She's never been able to declassify it, so we picked it up and tried. They never responded. Constructive denial from them. We are in the process of appealing that. We'll see if we get anywhere. But you say that the government denied any knowledge of the existence of any of this up until the days before publication. What was that experience like for you? What challenges did you face?
So, as you mentioned, we filed a lot of FOIAs. These government scientists that I interviewed, they did attempt to belittle my inquiry and belittle me. And that just made me more determined.
What did they say?
Why are you looking why are you looking into this old story? It's not important. We've been muckraked before. Why don't you? They tried to basically discourage me from continuing with this hunt. And, I was experienced enough at the time to know that this is always one of the ways that if you're an investigative reporter, this is always one of the ways that people try to discourage you from proceeding with your investigation, is to say it's non-existent, it's not important, you're a fool, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to remember, I worked for a very small newspaper. We weren't the Washington Post, so they might have taken them more seriously. But I just, I was very mild-mannered. I took my notes. I did my interviews, and I kept going. And they kept denying it, even after we had the documents showing that they had in fact done this. And we did many FOIAs. In fact, the document that helped me find Elmer Allen was a FOIA. The words Italy, Texas were in a declassified FOIA document, and it was in my folder for years. And for some reason, in my mind, I thought Italy, not Italy, Texas.
Sure. Yeah.
It was Italy. And then I was just sitting there one day reviewing everything, and I saw Texas and then really, literally, the light bulb went off. That's the experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
It is one thing to deal with discouragement from the government as you're submitting these FOIAs. And by the way, all of the professional kudos in the world, because it is so difficult. It's not as if you can go up to them and say, give me everything you've got about ever doing an experiment or injecting plutonium into a human being. You have to give them a great deal of specificity of scope in what you're asking for. You kind of have to know what you're asking for. So not only are you dealing with all of this and this red tape and bureaucracy and all of that, but from your paper as well at the beginning, I understand it's not as if your editors were over the moon about you wanting to pursue this project. What was the response that you got? And was there a great deal of encouragement and excitement about you wanting to delve into these records that even at that time were decades old?
No, that was another part of the story, because I came back that day after I found that footnote showing people had been injected with plutonium, and I told my editor, I said, the government injected people with plutonium back in the Manhattan Project. And they said, well, that's really interesting, Eileen, but we hired you to be the neighborhood reporter. So it was really, I just turned around and walked away, and I started working on the story in my spare time at night. And I wrote my FOIAs at night after I was finished with my day's work. And I did interviews at night, in the evening when I was finished with my day's work. But I have to say this about the paper. After after Eileen's wild goose chase bore fruit, when I found Elmer Allen, after that, suddenly they realized that, it wasn't a wild goose chase.
Yeah.
And they did throw their support behind me, and they got the paper's attorneys involved in filing brand new FOIA requests with the federal government. And then they began fighting the bureaucracy, get documents released. And they ran into the same obstacles that I did. But so initially it was, go away, you're the neighborhood writer. And then it was, let's go for it. So they did. And then when we published, I have to say the paper, it was amazing what they did. This Tribune's now folded. It doesn't exist. That's another sad part. But the whole front page, we ran a summary of this story and a picture. It took up the entire front page. And that was not my decision. That was the editor's decision.
Yeah.
They took the whole front page. We did special inserts. Finally, it did get a lot of play, in the paper, and they did, they were really great at the end.
I'm glad they got there in the end. And of course, in the end, you delivered them a Pulitzer as well for this work. But what a lesson for anyone in any profession, for that stick-with-itness at the beginning, that, you got that initial sort of brush off and that no, and you just donated your own time, and you did it after hours, and you wouldn't let it go, and all of us benefit from that. So I really thank you for that.
Still to come in part 2 of our interview with Eileen Welsome, author of the Plutonium Files. She describes the floodgates being opened by her research into the 18 human test subjects injected with plutonium. How it preceded the exposure of egregious secret experiments on Americans. More than 800 pregnant women fed radioactive iron. Young boys, many of them orphans, fed radioactive oatmeal. And a shocking experiment out of Cincinnati. Americans given full-body radiation, scientists watching them die days later. That part of the conversation is next week on The Truth of the Matter. This podcast was put together by Ryan Kerr, Ali Purser, Mia Balbincuesta, Cheryl Wong, Richard Bodie, and me, Natasha Zouves. You can listen to The Truth of the Matter with Natasha Zouves wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.